What a week it's been, Mr. Mayor. The last 96 hours, can you give a sense as to just how upended the city of New Rochelle has been?
Well, there's been a surreal quality to it. Certainly has cleared everything else off my schedule and has had a much more disruptive impact on hundreds of our residents, especially those who are going through a quarantine right now, which at a minimum poses a day-to-day hardship. But we recognize there are also folks who are worried about their own health, the health of their families, the health of their neighbors. And yet at the same time, I have been so impressed by and grateful for the manner in which this city has risen to the occasion. Residents are taking direction from public health officials. They are engaging in common sense practices. There has not been any panic or hysteria. People are approaching this in a way that is calm and serious and measured and proportionate to the challenge.
You described it as a moving target. Is that the hardest part of this, unlike when you're dealing with natural disaster, or that there's a beginning, a middle, and you can define wherever the end will be, at least you know. With this, you don't know what the next day will bring.
Well, yes, that is a part of the challenge, although logic tells us that the number of reported cases will continue to increase. Now, it's important to stress that that does not necessarily mean that the illness itself is spreading, rather that detection of the illness is spreading. We become more aware of those who have been infected. So it is impossible to know the scope and scale that this will eventually stabilize at. But we do know that the common sense measures that are recommended by public health professionals are the ones that we should always be employing. And to the extent that we can improve awareness of those measures, we will all be better off. I do have to add a special word of gratitude for and admiration to the community of Young Israel of New Rochelle, which of course is bearing the heaviest burden right now. And the degree to which folks in that congregation have demonstrated patience and responsibility and enormous regard, not just for their fellow congregants, but for our entire city, by voluntarily being engaged in this self-quarantine. We shouldn't underestimate the hardship that this entails and the fact that it's being done in a genuine commitment to the common good.
And I think, I spoke to some folks in the field of law, and they said, right now, a lot of this is recommendations. You can't really forcibly make people say there. The way the communities like New Rochelle, and there'll be many others in this country before this is said and done, you have to rely on judgment and discretion of your constituents, don't you?
Well, my understanding is it's a little bit in between. In that,
like so many things with this, right?
As of now, it is a voluntary self-quarantine, but the state has the authority as a backstop to enforce the quarantine. And that has been made clear to us as civic leaders, made clear to the leadership of the congregation as well. Everybody hopes and everybody expects that that won't be necessary, precisely because members of Young Israel of New Rochelle and others subjected to the quarantine have behaved so responsibly in such a public-spirited fashion. But if necessary, the state can direct, and county and local authorities may not be required to participate in measures to enforce the quarantine.
So, to me, what I would imagine, and by no means do you or any mayor of any city act unilaterally. There's officials from certainly the county, from the state level, even the federal guidance coming. You have the health departments. But from one day to the next, some schools close. Some places won't have basketball tournaments, for example, while the neighboring area will. There doesn't seem to be a uniformity to this. Some houses of worship say, don't shake hands. That hasn't been enforced in other places. How do you navigate that when your constituents say, wait a minute, they're doing this, we're doing that, who's right, who's wrong? How do you temper the balance between being cautious without being hypochondriac or not being vigilant without being reckless?
Well, you just put your finger on, I think, exactly what is the central public challenge. We want to make sure that we approach this with a level of focus and concern and seriousness that is commensurate with a very serious public health challenge. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we don't stray into panic, which would create its own problems. We can't simply withdraw from the life and commerce of our communities entirely. Now, when there is clear direction from a public health authority, from a public health expert, then the choices that are made by localities or school districts or families become relatively simple. The right thing to do is simply follow that guidance. But there are other cases in which it's shades of gray, and it's a matter of reasonable people using common sense and deciding what is their own risk tolerance. You know, for example, the county executive and I went out to lunch together at a kosher Asian restaurant in the Waikiki area. We did so to demonstrate that we ourselves are completely confident that we can do this without any threat to our health whatsoever, that we shouldn't be stigmatizing an entire neighborhood as though the virus was sort of a cloud that surrounded it. That's not how the virus is transmitted.
And if I could, Mr. Mayor, use the example of Seattle, for example. There's pictures now where it looks like a ghost town. Obviously, they've had incidences in Kirkland, Washington, and now there's even a few cases in the tech sector in Seattle. But for folks who don't know, and I've grown up in this county for almost 50 years, there's a renaissance going on in New Rochelle. I'm not saying because you're sitting across from me, but there are parts of this city that of 80,000 that are unrecognizable in a good way from ones that I grew up in. How concerned are you that because you don't know where the end of this is yet, that people, by being cautious, won't just not get on a plane now like we're seeing, but won't go out to have lunch like you did, won't go to the theaters in New Rock City or whatever else? How concerning is that? And for a county or a city whose bottom line relies so much on the commerce, how much is even a bad week, if it's a bad month, how much could that really impact the city?
Well, in the long term, I don't have any concerns about this at all. We're going to overcome this challenge. We're a resilient, strong community. And you know, whether it's a week or a month or 2 months, we're going to get back to business. And so I think we'll be resilient enough to overcome this. In the short term, I am concerned for our local business community. I'm just concerned for the fabric of life in New Rochelle, which is why, again, I suggest that unless there is a specific public health reason not to, that people are best off doing what they would ordinarily do, but taking public health guidance in terms of common sense measures that they can use to protect themselves and their families. Look, I respect everyone has to make judgments for themselves, yep. And people may set their risk tolerance at different levels. Obviously, if you're someone who has a compromised immune system or pre-existing respiratory element, you're going to set that level a little bit higher. If you are an otherwise healthy adult, you'll set your level a little bit lower. But you know, the analogy I've used with people is you can avoid any chance of a car accident if you choose never to drive and never to get on the road. But most people will not make that trade because we recognize that our risk avoidance needs to be reasonably calibrated to the actual threat that we face. And if we go past that point, then we only harm ourselves.
You've chosen, along with the other state leaders, county, and the medical community, to be as transparent as possible. We've seen that in the press conferences. You lay out exactly where things are, what the plan is. Obviously, there's been an investment by the state, even as they wait for some guidance or more help from the feds. But how do you, when one of your constituents says, well, what do I do if I'm not feeling good? And you say, well, if you're not sick, you don't go to work. Your president says, hey, go ahead and go. Or you are up front by saying you don't know when exactly this will end. The president says the worst behind us. How complicating is it, even more than it is, when you don't have a consistent message? And the one thing, as I've been reading the last week here, is the biggest mistakes are when there isn't transparency and there isn't credibility and leadership. How much has this White House made this job even more difficult than it already is?
Well, let me agree with your general point, which is that in a moment of anxiety and public concern, it's particularly important for people in leadership positions to speak with a voice that is clear and consistent. I can't speak to the federal government because, frankly, I haven't had any direct relationship with the CDC or the White House. My relationship has been primarily with state officials and county officials. And there I could not offer higher compliments. They have been outstanding. The governor has been outstanding. County Executive Latimer has been outstanding. Their respective health authorities have been wonderful to work with. We are all collaborating in order to maximize the availability of useful, accurate information to the public, particularly for those most effective, ensuring that they have the most robust access to both information and the services that they may need. And I don't want to overstate, by the way, my own role. The city of New Rochelle does not have its own public health apparatus or public health expertise. So we really take direction from county and state officials and do our best to support and assist their efforts. But I'm grateful that we can rely on their expertise because this is a moment when we need it.
I can only imagine if I was sitting at that desk the amount of unknowns going into this and really not having a walkthrough like this before. What do you do, for example? You have a lot of apartment buildings. What if somebody is self-quarantining in an apartment building, and even if the science says, it can't be transmitted just by being in the same building, there is a human element to this, and there's going to be fears. What are some of the realizations you came across that you never would have thought of until you've gone through what you have the last 72 plus hours?
It's interesting, you raised that as a hypothetical example, and yet I had a conversation about precisely that subject yesterday afternoon. And I guess it does illustrate what my role is, perhaps, as a connector.
You're the public face in this city.
Well, I did hear from a co-op leader at one of the large multifamily complexes that's in the area that's most heavily affected, with questions and concerns about exactly what sort of guidance should be offered to residents of that complex. So I connected her with an official at the County Department of Health. That county official was in turn in touch with counterparts at New York City who obviously have the most experience with multifamily units. And so the hope is that through that process of sharing information, people locally can be better armed with what to do. So I was not the source of information. I don't have that expertise. I don't pretend to have that expertise.
Right.
But hopefully I can play a constructive role in moving information from one source to another.
We've seen in different parts of this country certain populations, specifically Asian and even Orthodox communities, that have been targeted or blamed for this, irrational though that might be. Have you run into any of that here, and how do you try and get out of ahead from people scapegoating others when fear is probably as big a challenge as any in dealing with this?
You raise a great point. So look, in a community of 80,000 people, there are always going to be a spectrum of reactions, some appropriate, some inappropriate. But I am proud to say that for the overwhelming majority of New Rochellians, and the overwhelming feedback that I've received, has been nothing but support for and goodwill for all of our neighbors. The questions I get from folks are, how can I help? What can we do to support our neighbors who are in need? And it is absolutely essential that we not make the foolish conclusion, the wrong-headed conclusion, the morally wrong conclusion that certain people, because of their religious affiliation or their racial or ethnic background, are somehow to be excluded and isolated and ostracized. That is the worst thing we can do, particularly in a diverse community like New Rochelle, which prides itself on welcoming people of every heritage. And that's a key part of our identity and something we will always uphold.
This next question, there's no way you can know the answer, but just intuitively, do you think you almost have to prepare your residents that this is going to get worse before it gets better? As you said, when more kits become available, there'll be more testing and there'll be more detection. Whether or not it's more cases, maybe it's a byproduct of just having more information, but nonetheless, there'll be more. You're going to get questions, should people go on Metro North to get on the train? Should they go to the basketball game? Should they go to the mall? How are you going to answer that when you don't know when and how this ends and how big this gets?
Well, by being honest about what we know and don't know in all of our communication, and this is true for the county and state as well. We've indicated that there's every likelihood that there will be additional cases reported in the days ahead. We haven't put some artificial deadline on when this is going to end. What we have committed to is sharing information as we have it, recognizing that new directives may follow as warranted, encouraging everyone to stay abreast of the news and continue, again, engaging in common sense practices that can protect themselves under all circumstances, and taking it one day at a time. So I don't think there's any other way to approach this. But again, the good news is I think most people understand that, recognize that, are approaching this in a way that is logical and mature. And we'll get through this. You know, you never want to face a challenge like this as a community, of course. But it is heartening to see that when the challenge comes, people in New Rochelle are able to face it in a way that is so resilient and so strong and so illustrative of a commitment to each other.
Finally, when you get through this and you'll look back, even though there seems to have been terrific cooperation from the top down in New York for this, this hopefully will not be a new normal, but we should plan that we'll have to deal with something like this again. What needs to happen for people who sit behind desks like yours that are mayors in this country that you don't have or we didn't have in place that we need to have, whether it be on the medical side or whether it be protocols that don't exist right now? I mean, you deal with every facet of this, from the folks on the medical side to the leadership and everything in between. What isn't there that would have made this much more helpful as you look back in the last whirlwind of a week?
So that's a good question, and I don't know that I've yet had the time to sort of reflect on this in the way that I will in the days ahead. I know that from the public health professionals' perspective, being able to ramp up testing capacity is a real priority, and it's a constraint right now on our ability to respond. But I don't know that it's, and this is just my lack of expertise that's showing, I don't know that you can build up testing capacity for every potential illness. You know, this may be something that's just sort of baked into the cake as a limitation in all public health responses. So certainly, I think there'll be an effort at every level to absorb lessons once this episode is largely behind us and figure out what we can do to better prepare in the future. But there's also that great Mike Tyson line, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And we should recognize that every incident like this will have its own peculiar, unique characteristics, which cannot necessarily be anticipated in advance. And it's why having a relationship between different public authorities, between different levels of government, that is based on cooperation and trust is, in the end, maybe the most important asset, because it enables you to respond flexibly and effectively to whatever comes your way.
Yeah, siloing, as we've learned, never works here. But, and I never meant this more so than now. I wish you the best of luck. Honestly, from everyone I spoke to, you and a lot of other folks here have handled this the right way, but it's the unknown, right? And good luck with that.
Thank you very much, Richard. Appreciate it.